In this session today, we will be taking the conversation beyond the physical sauna and a bit into the physiological as we explore the possible benefits of sauna and heat therapy from a scientific point of view. Best equipped to do that are people with PhDs, but I must say this is not medical advice. This is research, so it's a little bit different, but it's quite a new perspective for us here, and we're thrilled to have you all here today. Moderating today is Dr. Earric Lee. Dr. Lee completed his PhD in exercise medicine in Finland with the University of Jyväskylä. His research focused in the adaptation of exercise combined with heat therapy for clinical populations in an applied setting. He is currently a postdoctoral fellow at the Montreal Heart Institute's EPIC Center, the largest center for cardiovascular disease prevention in Canada. He is joined today by some other experts in the field, Professors Ashley Mason from University of California, San Francisco, and Ant Shepherd from University of Portsmouth in the UK. So I hope you're all ready to get schooled in sauna a little bit. I know I am. So at this point, Dr. Lee, Dr. Mason, Dr. Shepherd, tervetuloa, and take it away.
Hi, guys. It's very, very nice to have all of you present today. I see we're close to 150 people. I want to just do a brief introduction of myself after Tom has already said some words about me, so I won't go into further detail. My name is Earric Lee, and I used to live in Finland for about 8 years, where I pursued my master's degree and also my PhD in exercise medicine, where I focused my research on combining exercise with sauna use and the long-term effects of such an intervention on physical fitness and some physiological markers of the human body. I'm currently based in Montreal, Canada, where we're having a blizzard and I'm stuck indoors for the whole day. So it's a great time to be talking to all of you. Otherwise, I'd feel a bit lonely and depressed, but I'm sure later on Ashley will tell us more about that. The Institute of Cardiology of Montreal, ICM, or Montreal Heart Institute in English, it is the largest cardiovascular prevention and research center in Canada. And oftentimes people have said that its reputation rivals that of the Cleveland Clinic and the Mayo Clinic. We are particularly in Center EPIC, which is a specific area of the Heart Institute where we study thermoregulation and how heat therapy affects the human body. And we do a combination of long-term studies and short-term transient effect studies on the human body as well. So I will be a moderator today. I hope you guys pose your questions into the chat. Any questions that are relevant to the discussion that goes on, I will gladly post them up to Dr. Shepherd and Dr. Mason. But right now, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ashley Mason, who will give us a few words about herself and the work that she does.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. My name is Ashley Mason, and I'm an associate professor at the Weill Institute for Neurosciences at the University of California, San Francisco. I'm also core faculty at the Osher Center for Integrative Health at UCSF. I did my PhD at the University of Arizona, where I also did my master's. I did a postdoc here at UCSF, and I've been a professor now for almost 10 years at UCSF. I am a clinical psychologist by training. I don't really see very many patients these days. However, I am the director of a sleep clinic at the Osher Center, and I treat patients with insomnia. My research focus, however, is principally on the treatment of depression using non-drug modalities. Specifically, I'm particularly interested in how we can use heat therapies to treat mental disorders, including depression and also insomnia. Let's see. In my lab, we have been doing studies that look at how we can combine both a heat treatment modality and also talk therapy modalities, not at the same time, but in the same 10-week period, to see if we can get better outcomes than just giving people, for example, talk therapy alone. I currently am funded by the National Institutes of Health and the U.S. Department of Defense, and my major focus across all of this work has been looking at the role of body temperature as a mechanism linking these kinds of heat treatments to psychiatric outcomes. But I'm happy to get more into each part of that work in this conversation, and I'm just really excited to be here. So thank you, Earric, for having me, and thank you everyone for having me.
Thank you, Ashley. Now let's hear what Dr. Ant Shepherd from University of Portsmouth in the UK has to say about himself.
Good evening, everyone. Yeah, thanks for the introduction. As you said, my name is Dr. Ant Shepherd. I'm an associate professor based out of the University of Portsmouth, which is on the south coast of the UK. It's currently about 0 degrees, a little chilly here as well. My foray into the extreme environments field occurred when I moved to the University of Portsmouth. So I did my PhD based out of the University of Exeter within the medical school over there, which is one of the Russell groups here in the UK. And I was working on nutritional interventions and how that can help people with different chronic diseases. When I moved to the University of Portsmouth, where I'm currently based, they're world famous for their extreme environments laboratory. So you guys might have seen them over the news. You may not have done, but we do an awful lot of research there looking at immersing people into cold water, hot water, and also into steamy environments and also hypoxia. And typically they were using those environments in Portsmouth to try and help military personnel, preparing them to go to arduous environments, looking at making athletes run a little bit faster. But when I got there, there was a bit of a nexus from someone who was running clinical trials and a team of people and knew how to try and get benefits out of different people. So there's a nice little synergy. So I've been in Portsmouth for about 8 years now, and we've been looking at how we can expose people to different warm environments and hypoxia to see whether we can help people with different chronic disease and maybe to improve their outcomes in terms of their pathologies. My work is funded by all sorts of different streams. So we have charity funding. We've got a lot of industry funding from different, say, hot tub and sauna societies. We get funding from different governments, all of it trying to improve patient outcomes. I lead a group looking at clinical health research. I'm just also leading or co-leading a centre across the whole of the university down here on the south coast, and belong to all different sorts of NHS, which are hospital trusts across the south coast of the UK, where we lead most of our trials out of. And that's me, Earric.
Great. Thanks, Ant, for the very, very detailed introduction. To any of our audience who have a problem understanding Dr. Shepherd's accent, please do not post the question into the chat. We will leave questions in the chat for subject matter. But thank you, Dr. Shepherd, for your once again, a very detailed introduction. Now, the first thing I want to really get into with the both of you is if we're talking about using heat to increase the body's core temperature, what are some of the things that happen to the body transiently as we expose the body to heat? I know Ashley is more of a brain and let's say above the neck, and then Ant is probably below the neck. So let's start from the bottom up. Let's start with Ant. Like, what can you tell us about what happens when the body is being exposed to heat?
I like the way that you start with bottom up, given that most of the ways we check our participants are safe is using rectal thermistors. So thanks for that, Earric. This is largely how this panel talk is going to go, just so everyone is aware. So when we expose people to warm environments, the first effect that we're going to get is peripheral vasodilation. So what that means is our blood vessels are going to start to open much wider, and we're going to increase blood flow to the periphery. The reason why we're doing that is your body is trying to direct blood flow out to your skin so that we can radiate some of that heat off into the environment. So that typically happens. To make that happen, we get an increase in cardiovascular strain. So the heart is going to pump, increase its amount of blood that's pumping out of the heart every single beat, to deliver that blood flow to the periphery, which is why in some of our studies we see some really cool results which show that you get this increase in energy expenditure. So you can see that we're actually burning calories in order to pump this blood to the skin and try and cool you down. Enough, Eric? Was that long you want me to?
I think we've moved up to the neck by that point now. So
Yeah.
Ashley, what happens in a transient manner, in an acute response manner, if you will?
Well, we also do bottom-based temperature measurement in all of my studies too. So unfortunately, no, we're not measuring the temperature in the brain. And in the studies that I lead, we're actually using a body heating modality whereby the head is outside of the heater. Now, I know this sounds very strange to a whole bunch of people who are using Finnish sauna, but in the lab that I have, we are heating up the whole body from the neck down. And participants in our studies are being heated for a very, very long time consecutively. Think like 90 minutes, for example. And we have a nurse-like person who sits at their head, provides them with water, ices their face, etc. during this treatment, and we're heating their body up to quite a hot core body temperature range. And there's a lot that we don't actually know in terms of what's going on in the actual brain matter during this, because unfortunately, while we've got some advanced techniques to assess animal brains while animals are alive, we don't have those quite so easily available for humans. So we're actually keeping their head quite cool. And what we hope that we're doing is activating some of those thermosensitive neurons that extend from the brain through the spinal cord all the way throughout the body, so that the brain is getting messages that the body is quite hot, but the brain actually isn't getting anywhere near as hot as the core body temperature is. Eric, I can take this now in a few different directions, but I can just pause there.
Take it.
Okay. So in our studies, when we're heating people up to what is 38.5 degrees Celsius core body temperature, or 101.3 degrees Fahrenheit, we're heating them up for about 90 minutes or so. And what we have found in our studies is that people have reductions in negative affect from before to after that 90-minute period, and increases in positive affect from before to after that 90-minute period. We've found these kinds of this pattern in people without depression and people with depression. And what we've also found is that in people without depression, so of course, I'm in the United States, and one of the things that we often have to do when we want to do a study that what we call the institutional review board finds to be somewhat risky, as they would say, is they say, okay, we'll do this in healthy people first. So in my first study with whole body heating at UCSF, we recruited healthy young people, and they weren't depressed. We actually had to recruit people who were not depressed, but we did see an almost statistically significant reduction in depressive symptoms from 1 week before this 90-minute treatment to 1 week after this 90-minute treatment. And that's somewhat remarkable because these were people who already weren't depressed. So they already had a low level of symptomology, and it decreased even more. But we did see this acute mood changes from pre to post sauna in those folks. And then we saw larger time frame reductions in depressive symptoms in those healthy folks. Fast forward to our trials with people with depression. In our trials, people with depression, we're combining heat treatment with a talk therapy treatment that's done at a separate time. And we had pretty remarkable results in our first trial that are now published in the International Journal of Hyperthermia 2024. And it's open access for anybody who wants to go and get it. But 11 of the 12 people who finished this 10-week treatment no longer met criteria for depression. That's a 90% plus remission rate, which is pretty high in terms of a clinical depression remission rate. For ballpark comparison, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, antidepressant medications work for about 30% of people who take them. And those 30% don't need further treatment. So this was a pretty impressive outcome. The average Beck depression inventory drop was almost 16 points, like 15.8 points. A clinically meaningful drop might be like 4 points. So we've had a pretty impressive show that something is going on with body temperature. I think the most impressive study, though, that we've seen to date with just looking at changes in core body temperature and how that may affect depression is from the Janssen 2016 paper, which I think is also not behind a paywall that anyone can go and look up. And they gave people with depression a single hyperthermia treatment, which is an intense body heating treatment, again, with the head out. And they found that these folks evidenced antidepressant responses for 6 weeks after one of these single, very intense treatments. So something's going on in the brain, but unfortunately, we can't quite measure it directly with a probe or an imaging technique while we're heating someone in one of these devices.
Cool, awesome. That sounds great. I don't see any questions about that because I think a lot of it is so technical, but it's great. What about Ant? What can you tell us about some of the effects that you found in your studies with using of heat?
Yeah, thanks, Eric. So just as a bit of background, my major specialty is in people with type 2 diabetes. So most of the work that I'm going to discuss today is in people with type 2 diabetes. The first set of work we looked at was, let's go back a bit. So the chronic issue with people who've got type 2 diabetes is that they get hyperglycemia. So that's excess blood sugar floating around in the blood. The problem with that is that high levels of glucose are toxic to nerves and also blood vessels. So what the body tries to do is to remove as much of that sugar from the blood as it can. So some people, initially you'll start excreting that through your kidneys start to fail, and we try to store that blood in different ways. So what we wanted to do is see whether using saunas could improve that. So there's a really cool study done back in 1999 by Hooper, and they showed, I think it was in about 7 people. They published this in the New England Journal of Medicine, 7 people, showing that you might be able to improve glucose concentration in the blood if you expose people to a warm environment. In this case, it was a hot tub. But largely what we're talking about is increasing core temperature. And regardless of the modality that you're talking about, sauna, hot tub, whatever it is, core temperature will increase. The really cool thing about increasing core temperature is you get your body tries to adapt, and on a cellular level, you increase what we call heat shock proteins. And these heat shock proteins have amazing effects in terms of improving things like inflammation, improving insulin sensitivity. So back to my research. What we tried to do for study 1 was to immerse people for a single 1-hour session where we tried to get core temperature above 38.5, but kept them below 39 degrees. So they were safe and they weren't going to get too hot, but we were giving them a really strong heating stimulus. Now, in that study, we didn't see any effects on glucose, but we did see some really sharp reductions in blood pressure. And we also saw some really big increases in total energy expenditure. So these people were doing some heavy amounts of exercise. And also heart rate went up significantly, and it stayed up for a long time after they got out of the hot tub. So they were working hard. So then we thought, well, okay, if one session isn't improving your glucose, what about if we looked at exposing people for a couple of weeks for an hour a day? And those studies have come out in the last couple of years, one of them actually a few months back. And we essentially showed that if you have a hot tub for an hour a day for a couple of weeks, your heart function will improve. So the amount of blood that you can pump per beat goes up. Your cardiac output improves. You get some nice reductions in systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure. And we show that ultimately it looks like you're probably even getting fitter. So these are what we've been publishing recently. What I would add to all of that is that what myself and most of the scientific committee are doing at the minute is looking at relatively small studies. So whilst we're talking about the effects that we have all seen, what we're doing is relatively small sample sizes, and the funding that we're going to need to show what we would call efficacy, to show this stuff is definitely working, is going to be much, much larger, or at least than what I'm currently getting. So that's current landscape of where we've got. If you want me to carry on, Eric, it might be worth just touching on the longitudinal work that's currently out there.
Yeah, sure. The longitudinal work that's been out there is work that has been mostly done in the cohort of the Finnish cohort, stuff that has been done by one Dr. Jari Laukkanen. it's been published since 2015. One of the problems that we face currently is the fact that they are very often cited, but a lesser known fact to most people is that these studies are done mostly on the same cohort, and it's questionnaire based, so it's non-experimental, and we can't really draw complete conclusions from this data because we're talking about the same people, we're just looking at them from a different angle. So we need definitely in this space currently more experimental research that helps us to find out what actually happens. So for instance, in the 90s, there were some studies that were conducted on sleep quality, heat therapy and sleep quality. So some of the researchers were using feet, just heating up the feet, right? Not even the lower body. And they found some efficacy in improving sleep quality and also the sleep duration. Now, what we often fault the landscape for, which is, oh, these acute studies might not always translate into long-term benefits, but then I often find myself having an internal argument of, well, yes, whilst that may be true, that the short-term or the transient effects of one session of heat therapy like the sauna or being in a hot tub may not necessarily translate long-term, but then for cases such as these, right, where you have improved sleep quality, is it really necessary to do a long-term trial? Because if they can do that and get good sleep quality, then they just the benefits speak for themselves. So there are a lot of ways to look at that information. And I think it's our responsibility in these types of discussions to actually parse this out for the audience so that they understand what they're reading. And I think that's a very important point that you just brought up, Ant. So yeah.
And the other point I would suggest is when we look at the longitudinal data, you aren't really controlling for any of the confounders, right? So it could just be, and this might be enough for the audience that's in this room, is that you go to the sauna and the effects on mortality suggest that you live longer if you use a sauna. But is that you have the financial ability to take the time off from work to go to the sauna? Or is it that your social economic status is a little bit better? Or is it just that the sauna is actually more beneficial for you? Which we're in this room, we're all studying the work. It's probably that, but the science isn't there to fundamentally prove it one way or the other, is where we currently are. But there are lots of promising signs with the effects that we're seeing, but I don't think we're at the stage in which we can call it efficacy yet.
Right. And just to go off on a slight tangent, we just got a question from, sorry for that, but we just got a question from one Sarah Tucker. Hope I pronounced your last name correct. So her question is, what temperatures are recommended for the sauna or hot tub to achieve the improvements with the body? So are there any kind of, from our research of what we've done, I know we spoke about previously about the elevation of our core temperature, and to a large extent, I told you I agree with you, but what are some of the temperatures that you have used in your study and the differences that you might have found?
Did you want to come in first, Ashley?
I mean, you're asking for temperatures in the body. I wasn't sure if that question was more going for some of the diabetes and the cardiovascular benefits that Ant was talking about, or if that's going toward the psychological aspect.
Oh no,
this is improvements with the body.
Like what kind of temperatures would the sauna be? Would the sauna be at, let's say, or the hot tub to be at? Like what kind of temperatures do we use in our research for those?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I can let Ant talk more about this, but there's two major differences that we need to think about here. One is, what temperature are we trying to heat the body to? And then what temperature are we applying to the body? And these are different, and they both matter.
Yeah.
Right. And the mediator here is, how long are we heating? Right. Because if we've got a lower temperature for a longer time, that might have a similar effect as a higher temperature for a shorter time. So it really depends on the outcome of interest that you're thinking about. Now, there was a Hanush or Janssen, I don't remember who the first author is, 2019 paper that says, are we ready for using heat treatment for depression? Are we ready as a field? Are we here yet? And they reviewed 7 other papers in that kind of mini meta-analysis and said, well, we think so, but there's so much variability in what people are doing in terms of what kind of heating modality, a hot tub, a steam room, a sauna, how long they're heating them, what temperature, and to what temperature. I can tell you for the research we're doing on depression, it all dates back to 2013. There was a paper by Hanush in 2013, and they targeted a core body temperature of 38.5 degrees Celsius. Why? Because that is the minimum value for a clinical fever. Like if you go to recognized in the medical literature. So they started with that value. And so since they found the effect using that heat level, that's what the people did in 2016. That's what I did in 2021. That's what I'm doing now. That's what I did in 2024. We're all kind of piggybacking on what we know has worked. The question is, does a lower temperature work? Well, the 2016 paper showed that maybe 37.5 degrees Celsius doesn't work so well. However, in that study, they only applied heat, believe it or not, legs down. So they weren't even heating the torso. So it's a little bit of a confusing comparison. All this to say is we don't really know the answer about what temperature is needed to achieve an antidepressant effect. I can tell you that in the heat treatment that we're using in my lab, Earric, can I take this opportunity to answer just a couple questions that are in the chat woven into my response?
Please do.
Okay.
Help yourself.
So some folks were asking, why not include the head in there? Well, if we put your head inside of a sauna and heated you to 101.3 degrees, you wouldn't be alive afterward to answer how you feel, right? You would die. We can't do that. It wouldn't work. So that's why we have to have your head out. Yes, it's for safety. And we can't do it. Believe me, I tried. For a year, my friends and I ran around to every sauna known to man to see, could we get a core body temperature of 101.3? I think one of us did once after running like a half marathon in an 85-degree day and then going in the sauna for like 25 minutes, but it's really hard to do. What?
What's that temperature in Celsius?
38.5 in Celsius, 38.5 and 101.3 Fahrenheit. So, anyway, where was I? So, yeah, we can't have your head in the sauna, and for this type of treatment. And then someone said something about, well, can you scan people's brains before and afterward? Maybe. I mean, it'd be very expensive to do, but the thing is, what would you be looking for? Right. First of all, analyzing fMRI scans, you need a huge amount of people if you're going to actually derive meaningful data from that. Second of all, you'd need to know an exact signature that you're looking for in the brain. And depression looks really different from person to person. When some people have depression, they can't sleep, they eat all the time, and they're very agitated. Other people who have depression, no appetite, sleeping all the time, and totally slow with everything, not agitated at all, right? So depression can look really different for different people, and it can look really different in the brain. And this idea that depression is completely present only in the brain is also something we might need to question, right? Depression can also possibly be throughout your whole body. So I'm not married to this idea that we need to be doing some sort of brain testing before and after. I also happen to think that people are experts on their depression. You can ask people, hey, how you feeling on this scale? And then you can ask people how they're feeling afterward, because depression is not diagnosed with a blood test or a urine sample. Depression is diagnosed by self-report of a patient. And so that's what we're most caring about. I think, oh gosh, there were more questions, but I'll stop there. That was a lot of talking.
That's awesome. So I wanted to add in, right, that there is an incentive for all the audience to think about this, to think about heat exposure and repeated heat exposure for health in this way. We've been working on this for a while, and we haven't really exposed this to the research community yet because it takes a gigantic effort. But I am going to go on a limb and express this to all the users, enthusiasts of sauna. If you think about heat exposure as in comparison to exercise, when you exercise, you do it at a certain frequency, X number of times a week. You do it for a certain duration, 45 minutes of aerobic activity like running or dancing or whatever. And then you also have intensity. How intensely are you doing it based on RPE, ratings of perceived exertion, or you're doing it to a certain percentage of your heart rate max or your VO2 max, things like that, right? So you got three ways of accounting for this particular stimulus called exercise. Now, I am appealing to everyone as citizen scientists to collect data on themselves prior to starting an intervention on their own of heat therapy. Or if you're already doing that, great. What you want to do is record the number of times you go per week for heat exposure. Then how long are you exposed to that heat? And then what's the temperature like? Now, I know that part gets a bit tricky because you can't measure your own core temperature. Or well, there are devices that claim that they can, but they are of little utility in terms of accuracy. So record the temperature at which you are sitting in a hot tub for, if the water is 40 degrees or if the sauna is 80 degrees. Now, these three things can be used as an index for your heat load. And what we're trying to do is to figure out, to compare if certain heat load ranges will result in certain effects. Now, it's very difficult to collect this data from a singular center, or even in a multi-center trial, this would be very difficult. But if people who are using the sauna already can collect the data for us, much like how you would already do that if you were exercising, right? People with their little notebooks, they write down, hey, I did 5 reps of 80 kilograms of a deadlift today, okay? And then you can track your periodization and your progression as per exercise and exercise intervention. Now, the same way could be used to approach heat therapy. And then we would know approximately how much heat you have been exposed to in the month, in the week. That could give us an idea of what does what. Because right now, we simply, if we're being honest, we're just throwing darts on the wall, hoping that the board will appear, if that makes sense. I don't know if Ant or Ashley wants to chime in on what I just said. It seems like I just shitted on all our fellow colleagues in science, but
No, there's a lot we
it's-
don't know. I think it makes a lot of sense. I like the darts, but Ant, you throw the next dart.
No, you're good. I just agree. I completely agree. But I'm also heavily on the side of big RCTs. Before long, we'll be doing big multi-center randomized international trials, which is where we need to get to, but we're not there yet. And in the meantime, citizen science is an interesting approach.
yeah, we'll get there. And I mean, we've already spoke about at length with Ashley, and one of the reasons why I fly around to different countries and different continents is to meet all of you smart people so I can put this plan together. Because I'm not
we just like coming on jollies.
Yeah. So yeah, so that's something that I haven't spoke to the both of you about, but has been in the works. Basically trying to come up with an index, with an index so that we can like what one of the audience, I think he's Kari from ISA, International Sauna Association, mentioned. So we want to sort of have a way to compare all the studies. And in order to do so, we need to have a standardized, in my mind, it would be an index so that we can look at ranges of between, okay, if this person was subjected to a load of, let's say, 10,000 in a month, how does that compare to someone who's been exposed to 20,000? And each number is just an arbitrary number that gives you a unit at the end, right? If you take frequency multiplied by duration, multiplied by temperature, you'll get a certain number. And then the number is arbitrary. But then what we want to look at in the end is what happens within a certain range of exposure. And, you know, a lot of the work that has been done by MAPS, multidisciplinary studies for psychedelics, they have an app, a citizen scientist app that they've been using to collect data from various different people. And it's actually pretty user friendly. And we're trying to get something like that done for heat therapy related studies. so that people can download the app, key in the data, and then we can see the data, and then we can sort of make more sense based on, let's say, user response. So yeah.
Yeah, I think one thing that there's a theme coming up in the chats about, infrared versus finished sauna, versus maybe hot tub versus, I think one thing to think, if we step back and we think what might all of these heating modalities have in common, besides the fact that they're all going to heat us up eventually, is that they all to some extent are going to trigger thermal overshoot. Earric, can I go into what this is?
Please do.
Okay. All right. So when your body is exposed to heat, like let's say you get into a sauna, your skin is sensing, oh my goodness, I'm in a hot environment. This environment is hotter than my previous environment, and I need to make sure that I'm keeping my core temperature where it needs to be, right? Our bodies exist at a very narrow temperature range on the scale. And when your body senses that it's in a very hot environment, what it starts to do is it starts to actually cool down your core. Or at least it's going to try, and it's going to many people in my studies, what we see rectally, and Ant, I'm sure you see this too, is that when people start getting their heat treatment, their temperature drops, takes a dip before it goes up, or it might stay the same for a while. But in our healthy study, I think every single person showed a dip before they go up. So what the heat treatment activated was this thermal overshoot of your body trying to actually initiate the cooling process before it even necessarily needed it, and it overshot, right? And so there may be something special about the extent to which we're triggering overshoot, or the degree, or like how fast, how long, how frequent, with the heating modalities that exerts some of these beneficial effects. And these may be common to all of the different heating modalities. I think there was a nice comment also about how, well, sauna is also a social modality, right? It's not just going into a warm room. There's a community component where you're connecting with other people, chatting with other people. That's totally true. Just for full disclosure, in the studies that I'm running, it's one person. There's not really a social component, except for if they start talking to the study staff team, and we have ways of, we chat with them if they want to chat, kind of thing. But some modalities, like going in a hot tub with friends, going in a sauna with friends, are going to be much more social and have those other components than going in like a single person infrared type sauna. But I think that a lot of these modalities have more physiologically in common than not. And what some of the modalities do differ in is the extent to which they're social modalities is kind of a big differentiator. But I'm sure Ant has a lot more to say about that.
Yeah, but my background is clinical exercise physiology, and the answer to improving outcomes with that is do the exercise that you're going to adhere to the best. Now, as a thermal physiologist hat on, when we talk about different modalities, you all have your favorite because that's the one you enjoy the most, and that's the one you're going to gain the most benefit from. But physiologically, the hill I will die on is that it's about raised core temperature and the change from where you started at baseline. That's where I come from. But the one that you're going to do the most is the one that you enjoy most, and that is what you should do. It's pretty simple. Back to the thermal overshoot thing. Maybe it is that you're cooling down. I have a little suspicion that it might just be redistribution of blood flow, where you've got cooler blood from different environments that then end up going to where you're measuring it.
I'm supporting that. I am supporting that. We can see that from our lab with the esophageal temperature.
Yeah, okay, maybe it is.
And it's entirely possible, but it is just interesting that probably it's what I was explaining is that it's something that probably all of these heating modalities have in common, that redistribution happens.
Yeah, for sure. I completely agree. But I'm still not, even though Earric might have some data in his lab, I'm not sure we actually do know. Again, with a lot of what you're going to hear today is we think, probably, let's do some more science. It's fun. And maybe we can keep growing the field until we get some efficacy data, which is what I'll keep banging on the drum for.
Yeah. And I just got a question about from an anonymous attendee. How wonderful. Wondering about fertility for men in the sauna. With a cooling pack, if we keep groin temperatures slightly cooler, such as under 110 Fahrenheit, Jesus, that's still pretty hot.
This one's for you, Earric. You love this chat.
It seems this would be fine. Not sure what studies things are based on. Recommendations are to avoid sauna and hot tub, but seems with sauna possible to keep groin temperature cooler. Now, we were thinking about inventing, this hasn't been patented yet, but if you have the funding, please do so. We were thinking about inventing a groin cooler. So it's what it looks like a chastity belt. So you put it on and I mean, the initial design looks more like a diaper, but if you put it on and you go in and you can keep the temperature of with Lil Johnny and his friends at a certain level, then I'm pretty sure you might be able to mitigate some of the negative effects of heating up the nether regions that doesn't get talked about very often. But this anonymous attendee is very, very up to date with the information. Yes, heating your crown jewels is not a good idea, especially for prolonged periods of time, especially when it comes to fertility related issues for men. Yeah.
Earric, did you send yourself that question by any chance?
I did not. I got my hands so busy. Do you think
every time we go on a panel together, this question comes up every single time?
I swear I should be in endocrinology and not physiology. Okay, there seems to be more questions now.
Oh, and the caveat to that is using sauna and getting warm testicles is not some sort of contraception that we are endorsing, just for the record.
Yeah. We also do not endorse the use of alcohol in the sauna. If you do decide to use alcohol outside, that is completely up to you. But certainly not within. One of the things that I wanted to bring up as well, which has something to do with Ashley's study, is the fact that there are actually a lot, and this is a pushback to some of the questions that the audience have asked, because there are actually a lot of studies that are quite obscure, because I'm doing a review currently of heat therapy, and I've come across some of these studies where the head is actually exposed, and there are various forms of which the person's body is in a box, and this box is being filled with hot steam. It's an Indian Ayurvedic tradition, and believe me, they have published studies on that. And so this is not something that is particularly new. And so I think there's value to that. When people think that we sit in a sauna and our heads get heated up as well, whilst that may be true, there's a limit to that, because the head starts losing heat as well. And there's a reason why a lot of people go to the sauna and they wear a sauna hat, because they want to keep the temperature of their head stable, because it gets hot, trust me. But then at some point as well, the blood from the cerebral blood flow gets redistributed, and we're talking about a 20 to 30% decrease. So your head tries to keep itself cool anyway inside a sauna room that's really hot. So in terms of putting someone in a sort of device where the head is exposed, I'm sure that's kind of similar to what's happening, what the body does to itself in the sauna, or in the case of like a hot tub, your head's exposed as well. What do you think, Ashley?
I'm going to caveat this with I have no idea, and I'll tell you what I think a little bit. I mean, I think that there is something to having the head out that I think is partially a function of form, right? Your head has to be out of the water. We can't breathe under the water. So everybody in the history of using hot springs, hot tubs, hot geothermal areas, their heads have just been out, right? So those cultural practices, they're just head out. I am sure that there are people in this Zoom who could provide an excellent lecture on the history of the sauna hat. I'm not going to begin to try and even touch that because I'm certain that I could be schooled here with that. But it does make a pretty big difference when I wear a sauna hat and versus when I don't. Gosh, ears on fire versus not. So there is this idea that it circulates in the popular media that we lose more heat through our head than anywhere else. This isn't true. And I maybe I'll just let Ant talk more about this, but we do sense our head does feel more cold. We often have more sensitivity to heat and cold on our scalp and on our head than, say, for example, on our arm. So we may feel like we lose a lot more heat that way. But my understanding is that we don't actually lose more heat through our head relative to through any other necessarily part of our body. It's not quite like our hands in that way. But Ant, do you want to fill that one in?
Certainly lose more heat from your head if it's the only thing out of the water.
Right. Okay, if it's the only thing out of the water, that's I'm talking about in normal conditions. But yeah, I think Earric, the unfortunate answer is just that there's a precedent for having your head out in our research studies, but do we know a whole lot about it, in modern RCTs? No.
Yeah,
By the way, RCT is a randomized, does everybody know this? A randomized controlled trial. I think we've been throwing this term around and we haven't defined it. Should we define it? Maybe we should define this.
Go for it.
A randomized controlled trial or a randomized clinical trial, they're both RCTs, are trials where people sign up for a study and then they are randomly, just like the flip of a coin, assigned to get one treatment or another. And this is a much more powerful way to draw conclusions about how something works than if we just survey people and ask them, how often do you use the sauna? Because Ant gave the example of, oh, well, maybe it's just that people who are more wealthy have more time to take off so they can go to the sauna. And it's actually the fact that they're more wealthy that's why they have better health outcomes and whatnot, not that they go to the sauna, right? But what a randomized controlled trial does is it mixes everybody up and it says, all right, half of you are going to get this and half of you are going to get that, or quarters or however many groups there are. And then you can really compare how a treatment worked or didn't work. And we don't have very many of those.
You give the same people both conditions in a random order, so you're your own control. Then you counteract all of the effects that could be socioeconomic background. You are your own control, but you've had both conditions with a sufficient washout between both. So those trials,
and then we measure you all along the way.
Yeah. Then we've got the holy grail of what we need to do in hundreds of people. Then we have evidence that governments start to listen to.
Yeah. So to wrap things up, as we are quickly running out of time, what has this discussion mostly been about is the fact that we have found some evidence for use of heat therapy in certain populations of people. And they have been effective within the confines of the settings that we have, or the researchers have decided to impose upon. And those settings are often based on years of spillover knowledge or carryover information that previous researchers have used. And of course, from time to time, some of us do tend to stick our head out and try something else. But for the most part, we continue with what works. For example, 15 minutes of heat exposure, or 80 degrees of the sauna temperature, or getting the core body temperature to 38.5, sometimes even 39. So there has already been a precedent that has been set, which we then, as fellow scientists, we follow. These are just recommendations that were made available to us. Unfortunately, for many of us in the audience, and certainly when I think back about the point before I started going deep into sauna research, these studies and this information might be very difficult to find. And even for researchers themselves, we have difficulty getting some of that information because it's often behind a paywall, and some of them are really old and we can't get a hold of them anymore. Like if you're thinking like papers from 1965 or papers from 1954, which have been very well done, but we can only get to read its abstract and we can't really go into its full form anymore. We can't see the methods. So we need to do a job of curating these things and to get more information out to the public. And I think this is just the beginning of that. I think the three of us being here and sharing what we know with the audience is a good start. And I think on behalf of Ant and Ashley, we'd like to thank Finlandia and Tommy for having us conduct this wonderful session of a conversation. And if anyone else has any questions, I think we all have our emails available for them to reach out to us. If I'm not mistaken, Ant has left his email in the chat. I've left my email in the question and answer section. And yeah, Tom, please feel free to share my email with any of the audience who are interested to ask more questions. And I think that's all from the three of us.
Wonderful. Dr. Lee, Dr. Mason, Dr. Shepard, this was a fantastic panel. I feel like we could have let it go for hours. The content in the chat, I think our Zoom machine almost broke. This has been more comments than we've gotten in a long time. I think Kari Laukarinen put it correctly. We need more of these conversations, more of this study, but you guys have really brought this sort of scientific perspective to our sauna conversation and sort of opened us up to a whole new world. So I thank you for being here on some of your days off. We really appreciate it. We've learned a lot. And yes, we're happy to connect anyone to these panelists. If you want to get in touch with Finlandia Foundation, we can certainly do that.